Okay, in terms of stuff, welcome to the second episode of Metaphysics. You were here last time, or if you weren't, cited by your name. If you already added yourself to a list, just sign beside that. And if you're new, just add yourself at the bottom. And then once add drop is done, I'll print up a fresh sheet rather than like printing every single day. And so eventually I'll have the correctly printed sheet. Okay, in terms of the deadlines, unchangified, so quizzes are part 1, covering part 1, deadline end of day September 21st, exam 1 covering part 1, and quizzes part 2 covering part 2, October 19th, exam 2, quizzes part 3, November 16th, and exam 3, 4, quizzes part 4, December 8th, exam 5, December 14th, noon. The paper deadlines are last time to drafticize the draft, November 9th, and you can do as many drafts as you wish until you get the grades you want, in which case you can say done and uploaded to Blackboard, or you just get sick of drafting to say no, no more drafts, or time itself comes to an end. Not all time, just draft time. The +5 bonus deadline, November 14th, end of day on Blackboard, get your base score +5. The full credit emergence deadline in case something goes wrong, but not super terrible things, on November 21st. And then the desperation deadline for half credit, December 7th. Friday. I think is it 7th or 8th? I'll check that. Before heading to the new stuff, anything about the stuff that has been, or other stuff that needs more stuff? Is there, yeah, lots of stuff in there. Basically, is there any stuff that needs more stuff? Okay, so last time we're looking at the introduction of metaphysics, and we saw it's all about the nature and structure of reality. What is really real for real. Now, we looked at, sort of very quickly, in limited detail, 3 of the classic problems: universals, mind, personal identity. And now we press on to more stuff. Now, metaphysics, being a branch of philosophy, part of academics, has, not surprisingly, a variety of vocabulary terms. And we'll cover these in more detail as we encounter them. But here are some of the common terms used in philosophy. And none of them, looking at them, they all seem, except for probably like this, they probably all seem pretty familiar. But not surprisingly, like with most academic stuff, the meanings of the terms philosophically differ from the meanings normally. Not like insanely different, but different enough that they mean different things. Now, as we saw last time, one concept in metaphysics is the notion of an ontological kind. And when people do metaphysics of ontology, they're claiming that certain things exist or don't exist. And by that, as I mentioned last time, not like particular things. So it's not a question of does this backpack exist, or do kiwis, the fruit or the bird, exist? It's questions of types of things. So a metaphysical ontological kind would be something like souls, or minds, or spirits, or time.
Transparent on a solid.
Yeah, do you like solids, does matter exist? Yeah, so questions like that. And so if you believe in matter, matter would be one of your ontological kinds. If you believed in souls, the soul would be an ontological kind. Now, property, of course, is something we talk about in normal conversations. And in normal usage, property is what? Something you own. Yeah, something you own. Your stuff. Now, philosophically, it means something different. Not like radically different, because we also mean by property quality. So we talk about like the properties of the backpack, having certain mass and density. So in philosophy, by property, we mean that, certain qualities. Now, as we'll see when we talk about our good dead friend Plato and others, there's the question of, metaphysically, what these properties are. So, questions like, what is color? What is mass? Not in the sense of like, saying like, well, color is like blue and green, etc. But metaphysically, what is it? Plato, as we'll see, spoiler alert, claims it's the forms, which are super weird things, but we'll see a lot of those. So in philosophy, a property is a quality, and one of the big debates is, what is the metaphysics behind that? What makes them what they are? And again, one of the first things we'll look at is Plato, and he says, hey, it's the forms. And other people say other crazier things, like, for example, I'm a trope theorist, which sounds crazy, but because it totally is. So I believe like properties are real, but I believe they're not Platonic forms, they're tropes, which is as crazy as it sounds. Substance. Now in normal life, if someone says they got some substance, what do they probably mean?
They have dust, belongings.
Yeah, stuff. Yeah, again, more stuff. So we think of substances as, for like in a movie, they might say, like a sci-fi movie, we found mysterious substances all over the abandoned spaceship. So we mean basically like stuff. Sometimes like illegal or illicit substances. Now in philosophy, of course, it kind of means a similar thing. It's stuff. But of course, it's got to get weird because it's metaphysics. Now, by substance, and this goes back to our good dead friend Aristotle. Aristotle says a substance is something that can exist on its own. You could, like matter perhaps. You could encounter it, and it doesn't depend on something else to exist. To give an example, you think of this folder. It's got all kinds of qualities. It's blue. It's pretty worn. It's got a particular shape, mass, density, and volume. Now, for someone like Descartes, he would say this is all, or other philosophers would say this could be considered like a substance. Why? Well, could you imagine a pretty stupid universe in which this was the only thing in the universe, just hanging out by itself? Folder universe 275. That may be weird, but you can kind of picture in your head, you had this like, folder sitting there all by itself. Not the stupidest universe, but in the top 10 million. There are other stupider universes. Now, this thing, of course, can hang on its own. It can be a folder, but could I grab it and pull away the blue and have a handful of blue? No. Could I have a handful of like mass? No, I can have a folder with all these qualities, but I can't pull away these qualities. So a substance, and the reason why people reluctantly believe in it is because we encounter not blue, we encounter blue things. We encounter not rectangle, we encounter rectangular things. And so the idea was, well, there's got to be some reason why we find stuff that's always like together. We don't find like blue drifting by itself. And so people said, well, this is substance. It's a thing with qualities. Now, as we'll see, one implication of this is if there's like a substance, maybe what could happen is if you could take away all the qualities, the blue, the rectangularness, etc., you'd be left with pure substance, which would be would be something, as Locke says, I know not what, something with no qualities but exists. Now, as we'll see, one of the things that divides, many philosophers is that debate about substance. One view, people who believe in substances say, yeah, you could in theory, pull away all the qualities and be left with just pure substance. But of course, if I took away all the qualities of the folder somehow, what would I have left on the desk? Well, a reasonable thing would be, well, let's take an example of a pie. So you have an apple pie. Take away all the apples, take away all the crust, take away the pan, what are you left with?
Nothing.
Yeah, you get a whole bunch of nothing. And so critics, as we'll see, say, well, if you take away all the qualities, you get a whole bunch of nothing. So substance is total BS. So one of the big debates in philosophy is, does this notion make any sense? And many philosophers say, no, it doesn't. Others say, yes, it does. As you might imagine, I also accept trope and substrata. So I figure if you're going to go crazy, you might as well just go all the way, because why not? Now, another question that comes up is, how many types of stuff do we have? Again, not in terms of individual things. Like,
No, wait. So, as a definition for substance, what would the good definition?
oh, good definition would be this. Substance is an entity that can exist on its own, independent of other entities.
Substance.
So the Aristotle definition.
Yeah, essentially Aristotle's. Now, depending on how strict you take it, if you take it super strict, if it's something that can exist with nothing else, later thinkers like our good friend Spinoza said, that can only be God, because everything else would depend on God. And Spinoza said there can only be one substance, God, and God's everything, and so he ended up embracing what's called pantheism, which is everything is God. You're part of God, I'm part of God, Folda's part of God, Trump is part of God, everyone's part of God. We're all God. It's not that we're gods, it's just that we're part of gods. Just like, my liver is part of me, and my liver and all my parts make up me. We're all parts of God. Which I think is probably a good title for an album, Parts of God. Yeah, copyright. Now, when you talk about what type of stuff there is, there's a question of how many different kinds of stuff you got. Not in terms of flavors, like at Baskin Robbins, like how many ice cream flavors you got, but in terms of the ontological kinds, like what are the most basic entities. Now, there's basically three options. There's one type of thing that makes up everything.
Mm-hmm.
There's two types of things that make up everything, and then there's more than two that make up everything. I guess you could also take the view in Buddhism in which there is zero things. There is nothing. And we'll see that later on. Now, one of the most common and popular views among humans is what's called metaphysical dualism. And it's something everyone's familiar with. You might have not heard it called that, but it's something everyone is familiar with, and at least according to some recent research, it's what kids kind of naturally believe, supposedly. And here's the picture. There's two basic kinds. Matter, physical stuff, and that's, this stuff. And then there's immaterial stuff. Well, antimatter is still, good question, good point. Antimatter is antimatter, but it's still, broadly speaking, material. It's still physical. So that's a good point. We should probably just call it physical stuff, because there would be matter and antimatter. Which, it's cool if you want to blow stuff up. Probably the coolest thing for blowing stuff up, as far as we know. Now, so the second type of stuff is what's called mind, or spirit, or soul. Again, this is a common view. And when I was a kid, I didn't know metaphysics when I was a kid, but I remember going to church and they're talking about, you got a soul. And so if you believe you've got a body, but you are a soul, you're a metaphysical dualist. And most people tend to be that, at least kind of initially. Now, another view, popular view, is instead of having both of these, it's called dualism because there's two types, physical, non-physical. And this stuff is supposed to think and not be material, not be in space and time. And this stuff exists in space and time, it's three-dimensional, but supposedly it doesn't. This is all kinds of implications, we'll see later. Now, another option is to get rid of one of these. Now, if you get rid of the mind, the soul, then you'd be what's called a metaphysical materialist or physicalist. The view that all that exists is physical. No soul, no ghosty stuff, just pure matter. And most scientists and most philosophers today tend to be materialists. So if you were to ask, your typical physicist, where does the soul figure into this? They'd probably say, none of that stuff. Now there are physicists who do believe in souls, but most scientists today tend to not be dualists. Back in the day, pretty much every scientist was a dualist. Descartes, Newton, etc. Now the other option, which is kind of weirder, and these views are monism. So monism means you believe there's one type of thing, like body or soul. So if you think that all there is just one thing and it's matter, you'd be what's called a materialist or physicalist. You'd embrace materialism or physicalism. Now, a much less common view, but not unheard of, is to reject body and say that everything is just mind, spirit. This includes our good dead friend Berkeley, not the basketball player, but the dead guy, really dead guy, and also our good dead friend Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and others. And sometimes called idealism. Of course, in normal life, you talk about idealism, what do we mean? If someone says, "Oh, that's Sally, she's such an idealist," what do they mean?
More magical, translucent, go between reality and imaginative.
Yeah, that she has like these principles and she's not like really concrete and focused. She just believes in all these, high ideals. But in philosophy, idealism means, in this case, that all that exists is minds. And it's sometimes called, maybe to be clearer, phenomenology, that all that exists is phenomena.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
How could they logically support that idea that the only thing that exists is the mind?
Well, there's actually some pretty good arguments. We look at this guy, Berkeley and Hume and Leibniz. But one easy way to do it is this. Everything you experience, where do you experience it?
Well, first in your mind.
Yeah, all in your mind. Because this is kind of epistemology, but that all that you experience, like, you could be dreaming now, but one thing you do know, as Descartes argued, if you're dreaming, you do exist. That's one thing you know for sure. Now, the challenging part is getting to what seems normally obvious, namely that there's stuff out there. So whether you're dreaming or awake or in the Matrix, you can be sure that you are thinking stuff. There may be no board, there may be no me from your standpoint, but your mind is thinking about stuff. So maybe all this is just a random thought in your dreaming mind. And so that's why in a way it's kind of weird, but that's appealing, because the one thing you know for sure is you're thinking stuff, and you don't know if it's real stuff, but you're thinking it. And so kind of weirdly, what seems crazy, this could all just be an all-in mind.
So this mind is creating so it could comprehend better a physical you.
It could be, or you could just be dreaming.
Yeah, that's
You could, it's like the old Chinese story. There was this philosopher who believed they dreamed they were a butterfly, and then they thought, when they a philosopher dreaming they're a butterfly, or are they a butterfly dreaming they're a philosopher? And of course, the point is you don't know. I mean, you know you're dreaming, but you don't really know what's real. Yeah, so in a way it seems crazy, because the most sensible thing is there's just, physical stuff around us, but all we ever experience is our own minds. So idealism in a crazy way makes the most sense, which is what Berkeley argued. He said, hey, I'm the common sense guy. It's this matter that's crazy. Last two concepts, particular versus universal. Now, in the battle over the problem universals, one concept is the notion of a particular. And it's a fancy term for an individual. So the idea is that a particular is an individual thing. So you or me or the folder or the expo marker, those are particulars, single entity. Now universals, and we'll see when we get the problem universals how problematic and weird this is. A universal is something that can be head by many things. So for example, take like the green color of the chairs. Each chair is individual. You know, there can only be one, this chair, but there are many greens. So universals are things that can be head by many things, whereas
Headed or had?
oh, head, possessed. Fine. So like you can have all kinds of green things. You can only have one like you, but you can have many green chairs. You can only have one, this chair, I shall call this chair Fred. They can only be one Fred, but there are many chairs and many green chairs. So those would be universals. And so going way back to the time of Plato, the question is, how is that possible? How are all green things green? What makes them that way? And the obvious answer is, because they're green. But Plato, as we'll see, gives kind of a crazy answer. And these are a few of the concepts we'll see throughout the course of the course. And when we get to concepts that are like weird, which they'll all be weird, I'll define them again. And also when we run into kind of newer ones that are not on this list, I'll define those as well, because weird stuff. Before moving on to our next exciting slide, anything about any of this stuff that needs more?
What did you say about dualism and materialism?
Oh, dualism is the view that there's two types of basic stuff. The most common version is the view that there's mind and body. Strictly speaking, though, you could have other forms of dualism. You have to have just two basic kinds, and it can be any two things. But again, for the most part, pretty much people tend to be dualists about mind and body. And the other one was materialism. Materialism, the view is that it's a monist view. There's one type of thing, and this thing is physical. It's matter, whatever that is. So most people are dualist, kind of intuitively, and then most people, once they get like too much science and philosophy, tend to head to materialism. At least now, it's kind of the end thing. Eventually, probably will be out again, because just like with fashion, things come in, things go out. Like those bell-bottom pants, which they later called flare jeans. They came in, they went out, they'll be back again to torment and haunt us forever. Such is the nightmare of the bell-bottom. Now, since metaphysics is kind of like weird, a good question is like, how do you do it? How do you play the metaphysical game? Now, on one hand, since it's like not only philosophy but really weird philosophy, you may think it's kind of like a just make stuff up. There are first rule of Metaphysics Club is don't talk about Metaphysics Club. The second rule is, of course, you could say, well, just make stuff up, which is always an option. So how do you tell when you're building a theory? How do you tell like what kind of guidelines or what type of rules you're supposed to kind of follow? And how do you tell when you get like a good theory or bad theory? Like how do you tell if you're maybe right or maybe not right?
Structure support.
Yeah, you gotta support it. You gotta back it up. Now, interestingly, doing metaphysics is a lot like buying a phone or a car or a laptop or a meal or anything. Now, this may be due to sort of the contamination of economics into everything, but the idea, and it's something that is used in science as well, because let's take the basic method of science. The idea is basically what's called an inference to the best explanation. You say, here's a phenomena, like, okay, we've got the universe. How do we explain the universe? And what we try to do is give the best explanation, and then we consider all these factors and decide, sorting out what is the best. And so in metaphysics, we do the same thing. We say, okay, we're trying to explain something like people. How do we explain how people can seemingly talk and think and so forth? How do, or we're trying to explain time or space. So then how do we say like one explanation is better than another? And here are kind of the rules that we kind of play by now. And if you've done like the sciencey stuff, same thing. Not surprisingly, because science is just philosophy with bigger budget. It's true. So the assessment basically involves, just like in science or buying a phone, looking at the pluses and the minuses. And the idea being, just like if you're picking a phone or a scientific explanation, whatever one has the most plus and the least minus together, that's your winner of the moment, your theory of the day. And just like in the sciences, or just like with phones, that can change, pretty rapidly, depending on when new contenders or new assessments come in. Now, kind of the main standard, the main weapon of metaphysics is the classic Occam's razor, developed supposedly by William of Occam. You may see it spelled differently. Sometimes it's two C's. Sometimes they throw like an H in there. So there were no real standardization. Now, his original statement was, do not multiply entities beyond necessity. The idea being, and this provides sort of the fundamental tool of metaphysics and science. When you're explaining something, the theory that has less entities, less ontological kinds, that is the better theory, assuming all of the things are equal. Because the idea is, we'll see, claiming that things exist comes with a theoretical cost. So, crudely put, if you have two theories that do the same work, but one has, two things, kinds, and one is one, the one with one is better, supposedly. So what would be an illustration of this in philosophy? It's also used in science. Also, even occasionally shows up in like crime drama shows. They'll talk, I can't remember which show, where they won their saying, use the term Occam's razor. For Occam's razor, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, you used it right. I was pretty proud, happy with that. Those are little victories in life. People using philosophical terms correctly. I was like, that person took intro to philosophy, that writer. Or maybe got their PhD, went on to a lucrative career in writing things. So let's look at how Occam's razor would be used in a real scenario. Now, one of the biggest things to explain, literally the biggest, is of course reality, everything. The universe, or if you want to get beyond that, the multiverse, all the things that there are. So this is everything, not drawn to actual size. So one question is, how do you have all of this? Now, one explanation people give is, of course, God created all this stuff, or some type of creators or creator. Now, another explanation is there is no creator, stuff just happened. You just have the theory of it's a random universe, there's no creator, it's like always been, or it arose in some other manner. Now, by Occam's razor, if you have two theories, one, God created it all, the other is it just is, if both theories were equally good, the one that says no God would be the better theory by Occam's razor, because this theory with God requires God plus the universe. The other theory just requires the universe. No
So
God.
less is more.
Yeah. Now, it's also used, of course, on smaller scales. So, for example, use a pretty straightforward example. This is a phenomenon known worldwide throughout human history. The more common contemporary name for it is night terrors. And the experience is this. Person wakes up, but they can't move, they feel paralyzed. And then suddenly they realize that something is in the room with them, something terrible, something evil, something with who knows what terrible intentions, moving closer, ever closer. They cannot move, they cannot even scream, and there it is, one step closer. Now, of course, that's pretty terrifying. Now, people have been having this throughout history, credible people recording it, and a good question is, how does that happen? Now, one explanation put forth back in the really old days was it's some sort of evil spirit, a demon or a devil or a witch. In the 1950s, it became aliens with probes coming to do some probing. And since this was reported so often, scientists thought, maybe people aren't just making crap up, maybe there's something real going on here. So one explanation is, demons, devils, witches. Another one is like aliens. But an alternative explanation is this. Have you ever wondered why, like when you're asleep and dreaming of like running or doing stuff, you're typically not doing that stuff? Like for example, have you ever seen like dogs sleep? They'll twitch a little bit, but they don't actually typically get up and run around. And it's a good thing, because if you just got ran around randomly, you'd probably die. Now, crudely put, we have like a safety switch. So when you're asleep, you still move around, but you have a safety that keeps you from going and doing stuff most of the time. Some people do sleepwalk, etc., but most of the time it works. Now, sometimes though, this can like catch. So like you're awake, but your safety's on. So you're awake, but you can't move. And they found that, kind of go along with this, which is kind of obnoxious, is you get that feeling of terror, that there's something present, something awful. And they've been able to recreate this. They put on electrodes and just zap someone, they get that sensation. So we have two explanations, demons or just malfunctioning, part of the brain. And of course, by Occam's razor, one just requires the brain, the other requires the brain plus demons and stuff. So by Occam's razor, that explanation is better. It's just a malfunction. And so Occam's razor is probably the most powerful, one of the most powerful weapons in the arsenal of science and philosophy. If you don't need it, and it doesn't, you can explain it without it, then toss it. It's been ruining things for a long time.
So really it's like what's can be physically there or like shown to be what could actually be there, that's proof?
Yeah, good point, because typically it does tend to cut away all non-physical things. Now, of course, part of that is because, to be fair, philosophy and science now is a very physical bias. So it's kind of the point now where anything that's not physical, broadly defined, just gets tossed out. Now, it would be a mistake, though, to simply say that everything has to be physical, because that would be assuming materialism is true. So far it seems to work pretty well. We got rid of ghosts and demons and devils and so forth, but we shouldn't assume that, therefore, there is no non-physical stuff. But yeah, it's a good question. So in a practical sense, yeah, it's pretty much been cutting away all non-material things, since like the modern, since like the 1400s, 1500s. But we should, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything does have to be material. Because Occam's razor, cuts without bias. If we couldn't, take an example like our consciousness, we have yet to be able to fully explain it using just the brain. Scientists say, okay, it's just the brain, blah, 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 but we don't have a perfect explanation. So we can't say for sure that we don't have something else going on there.
Brain versus matter.
Yeah, but in general, you're right. Typically it's come down to, we look at the empirical evidence, and that's biased heavily towards materialism. But in theory, the razor could cut and still leave behind non-physical things. Yeah, but so far it's been butchering all the ghosts and it's a great weapon against ghosts and devils and demons and souls and spirits. It just cuts the hell out of it, leaving nothing. And unicorns. kill the unicorns too, which is kind of sad. Feel bad for those unicorns.
How would we write that as a definition?
Oh, definition, Occam's razor is the principle that you should not multiply entities beyond necessity. Put in terms of like a principle, if you have two metaphysical theories, or any theories or explanations, the one that involves all the things being equal, the one that involves fewer entities is better. The idea being economically it costs less.
I put after, don't multiply to this more than necessary. I put less is more.
Yes, also good.
Would the theory that the least assumptions are most accurate also be good?
It can be, because people often broaden it to like about having fewer assumptions. So in the general sense, yes. Strictly speaking, like kind of the strict Occam's razor is about entities. But yeah, the idea of simplicity being better, fewer assumptions is better, does often get rolled into Occam's razor. Yeah, so in general usage, that's how people often typically use it. Okay, anything else about the razor that needs more stuff? Now, simplicity, and again, many people often kind of, put Occam's razor together with simplicity. The idea is this: everyone's heard the, sort of dictate, to keep it simple, and the same thing applies to metaphysical theories. In general, if you have two theories, two explanations, and one is less complicated, one is more simple, or simpler. I think that's right. I got a D in high school English, so it still haunts me to this day. So the theory that's simpler, all other things being equal, would be better. For example, sometimes people do this for like comic effect. Like there'll be some elaborate thing, there'll be something that occurs and they'll say something like, oh, I suppose this person just tied themselves to a chair, then stabbed themselves 23 times and threw themselves out a window and then drove themselves off into the swamp. And of course, the simpler explanation would be someone killed them. And so the idea is, with a simpler theory, the less complicated the better. So if you have a metaphysical theory that has all kinds of complicated notions and moving parts to it, and one is simpler, then it's better. And as I noted, people often today kind of squish them together, although they're somewhat different. Occam's razor is, again, how many entities do you have? So if you have a theory that's got God and the universe, and one's just got the universe, then that's, by Occam's razor, the better theory's just got the one entity. Simplicity could also factor in too, because obviously a theory with one entity is simpler. But simplicity also extends beyond just the number of entities, because you could have a theory with like one entity, but it can be like super complicated, have all kinds of complications in there. So the idea being that the simpler explanation is better.
The flow of things is much clearer.
Yeah, because the assumption is, which could be mistaken, because all these rest on assumptions. Occam's razor, ironically, is based on Occam's idea that God works and doesn't make things beyond necessity. What is kind of ironic is then the razor is used to chop away God. And the same thing, simplicity rests on an assumption that things were simple. That reality works in the simplest way possible, which may not be, which is an assumption, a metaphysical assumption itself, that simpler is better. Now, in terms of like when you're building stuff, simpler is generally better. For example, anybody ever use the command line, like on their, like in Windows or Mac? And why don't you use the command line? It's there. It's still there. You can do it. You can go in there, run the command line stuff, do all kinds of things. Why don't people do that anymore?
Just general knowledge of knowing that they exist and what to do with it.
Yeah, people do, because it's, most people don't know it anymore, and also it's super complicated. So if you just want to like, you open a file. If you open a file like using the normal interface, what do you do? Yeah. If you want to open a file using the command line, you've got to like type in like C:, and you got to get all the paths to it, all right, single typo, and that's not gonna open. And that used to be the way all computers work. That But of course, it's super complicated, so no one uses that. Well, some people do. Sometimes you have no choice from troubleshooting, but people don't use it because simpler is better.
So simplicity simply means to clarify.
Yeah, it's clear, simple, uncomplicated. But it is a fair question, like when it comes to, technology and stuff, rules and stuff, we do want simpler is better. Being able to just, click an icon, that's better than having to type out like all the commands. But there is the fair question of, is reality like that? Is the simpler theory, the simpler explanation, always the better one?
No.
Maybe not. But in general, in terms of scoring points, simpler theory, better theory. Now, weirdly enough, because metaphysics is like super weird, mystery and weirdness is a factor. Because even when you're in a weird part of philosophy, there are degrees of weirdness. Some weirds are weirder than others. Now, that of course is pretty subjective, because it's kind of like beauty. As the saying goes, beauty is and weirdness is in the eye of the weird holder. Kind of like with behavior. Like what counts as weird behavior depends on
What normality is.
Yeah. So if you're like a gamer, sitting around like rolling dice or working in a controller, that's perfectly normal. Other people, it seems crazy. How can people do that crazy stuff? Or like athletes. Objectively, it seems like being athletic seems kind of crazy. It's like, what are you doing? I'm running around in circles on a track. Why? Don't you have a car? I do have a car. And I'm still running around in circles on this track. Yeah, so what seems weird depends on, what you think of as weird and normal. So this is a bit subjective. But even within the realm of the weird, there are things that are more weird. So for example, Plato's forms, which we'll see, they supposedly exist outside of space and time, which is pretty weird, because they're not only nowhere, they're no when, because they're not in space, they're not in time. Yet they do stuff here. And of course that seems totally weird, totally crazy. And so it's a fair point to bring up as an intuition argument, this is weird. Now the challenge of course is kind of making that stick. I mean the same thing works in science. When they bring up things like dark matter and dark energy, people will say that's pretty weird. But, it's a minus, but again, you're always going to have some minuses. So weirder, in this context, worse. Less weird, better. Now this also kind of links up to plausibility. The more intuitively plausible a theory is, the better. Because, plausibility means what? Something's plausible.
Explain them.
Yeah, it's also, if someone's story is plausible, you probably what?
More logical.
Yeah, you think it's possible, you probably believe it, as opposed to like an implausible story. Yeah, so if a theory seems plausible, then that's more points. It seems more intuitively appealing. Now, of course, it could turn out that the correct theory is totally weird and implausible, which sometimes happens, but in general, plausibility is a plus. Now, going back to a point you raised about assumptions, one thing that every theory has to have is what's called primitives. Not in the sense of like, low-tech stuff, but in the sense of, in a theory, something as a primitive means it's not explained. You just say, this is how it works. You don't analyze it further. Now, every theory has got to have that, because otherwise, if you had to analyze everything, when would you finish your theory?
So you mean the primitives, they may not be able to be explained, or they just don't get explained by choice?
Yeah, good question. Sometimes people say it can't be explained, unexplainable. And other people, sometimes they say, this could be explained, but I can't do it in my theory. I've got to have a stopping point. So different theories can leave different things unexplained. Like some theories will analyze something and not take it as primitive. Whereas some theories will say, well, I can't analyze this because this would take me someplace I don't want to go. So sometimes,
Sometimes there's a time where like, time people make it primitives too.
yeah, maybe, it could be a practical thing. I don't have time for this. But more often than not, like, it's for the two reasons you gave. One is, a person may say, this is unexplainable just simply. No one can explain this. Or maybe that I choose to leave this unexplained because I have to because of my theory. Because if I tried to explain it, it would
Take us off course.
yeah, maybe it would lead to some, some problems or impossibilities. For example, in what's called trope theory, the claim is, going to the problem universals, and we'll see more of this later. A trope theorist would say, okay, this is green, and that chair over there is green, because the quality of green between these two chairs, they exactly resemble each other. Now, a person who believes in universals would say, they resemble each other because of identity. So they would analyze resemblance in terms of having some things that are identical. Now, a trope theorist doesn't want to go there because if they do, as we'll see in the future, they couldn't maintain their theory. Because the trope theorist's view is there is no identity between the chairs. There's nothing identical between them. There's just resemblance. And so if they do analyze it, they basically just killed their theory. Their theory just dies. And so they can't do the analysis because if they did, that'd end of their theory.
So I have a question. Why maintain that theory when you know if I analyze it further, my theory is disannulled?
Because every theory has that problem. Because every theory has to leave something that you don't explain. For example, I can kill the universal theory as well. Universal theory says, this green and that green are identical. They explain resemblance, by analysis. But then you say, but then what is identity? And if they say, well, they're identical because they share the quality of identity, then they're off, then you could say, well, what's that identity? And they'd say, oh crap. And we'll see this, what's called infinite regress. So every theory, usually on the pain of like death, has to say, I can't analyze that. Now, you may say, hey, doesn't that mean every theory's got a problem? And the answer is yes. So the idea is one principle, general overarching principle is this. It applies everywhere, philosophy, science, political candidates. If there's something that's a problem for everything, it's a problem, but it can't be a problem for any particular, say, theory. To use an analogy. Suppose you have 4 people running for office, and you're like in a state like California where you can't write in. You have to pick the 4. And suppose all of them committed adultery. They're all adulterous. And you don't like adultery. Well, it's true they all suck. They're all adulterous. You don't like adultery. But does that disqualify any particular person? Well, is there any non-adultery to pick? Now, if you're going to pick, you have a choice of what?
Picking a new group or choosing one of
Yeah,
them?
if it's California, you can't write in. You got to pick what they give you. So your only options are you don't vote, or you pick an adulterer because they're all adulterers. Yeah, so if something's a problem for everybody, or then it is a problem, but it's not a particular problem for candidates. So if you have 4 candidates running and one says you're an adulterer, the other one says hey you too, then yeah, it's a problem for all of them, but it doesn't disqualify
Disqualifying them.
Yeah, because they're all adulterers. Now, if you could find someone who's a candidate who's not an adulterer, then great. But if it's a problem for everybody, it's not a particular problem for anybody. So everyone's going to have primitives, and true, that's always a problem. You can always hit people on that, like, you get that primitive, but of course, that's a problem for anything. So the question is, how weird is a primitive, how many do they have, and how costly are they? In some cases, it's pretty simple. So if a theory says, things being identical, I can't explain that further. They're just, if something is, it is what it is. I can't explain that anymore. And you'd probably say, yeah, that's reasonable. But if someone says, well, the mind is a primitive, I can't tell you more of the mind, you'd probably say, well, if we're going to theory of mind, we just can't say it's unexplained, you gotta explain that stuff. Okay, so next time, we'll talk about more explanations. So have a good rest of the day, and enjoy the rain.